The dust of the high plains settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the tongue and clung to hope until it, too, was the color of rust. Maeve felt it on the worn fabric of her dress, in the grit beneath her fingernails, on the discarded letter that lay like a dead leaf at her feet. The word unsuitables had been scrawled in a hasty, dismissive hand, a judgment delivered from a man she had never met, a man who had seen her descend from the train and had simply turned his wagon around. She was a parcel returned to sender, only there was nowhere to return to. The platform of the desolate railroad station was now her entire world, a splintered stage for a very private humiliation. Men in town stared, some with pity, most with a casual cruelty she had long grown accustomed to. She was a woman of substance, a woman built not for the delicate sensibilities of drawing rooms but for endurance. Her size, which her family had called a burden, was a testament to a body that had known work and little comfort. But here, under the vast, indifferent sky, it was merely a mark of her unworthiness. Then, a shadow fell over her. He was a man carved from the land itself, tall and broad, with eyes the color of a winter storm. He didn't speak, not at first. He simply looked at her, then at her sturdy trunk, then back at her face, his gaze missing nothing. There was no pity in it, but there was no scorn either. There was only a profound stillness, a silence that seemed to absorb the town's noise. His name, she would learn, was Caleb Thorne, a man whose name was spoken in whispers, a name synonymous with sprawling acres and a grief as vast as his land. "I need a housekeeper," he said finally, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. It was not a question, not an offer of salvation. It was a statement of fact, a transaction. "My daughter needs minding. You can cook." Maeve could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears and prairie dust. He named a wage that was fair, more than fair. He spoke of a room, of meals, of work. He did not speak of kindness, or welcome, or tomorrow. He was buying a pair of hands, and she was selling them because she had nothing left. She nodded again. He lifted her trunk with an ease that was startling, placing it in the back of his wagon as if it were a sack of flour. He did not offer her a hand up. He simply waited. As Maeve climbed onto the hard wooden seat, the crumpled letter fluttered in the breeze, a final, pathetic farewell. The town, with its judging eyes, receded behind them, and they rode into a silence broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic plod of the horses, two strangers bound by necessity, heading toward a home that had long forgotten the meaning of the word. Caleb Thorne's ranch house was a testament to a fortune built on grit and a heart sealed in ice. It stood against the horizon, a two-story monument of timber and stone, grand and imposing and utterly devoid of life. From the outside, it spoke of power and permanence; inside, it whispered of absence. Dust lay thick on the heavy mahogany furniture, not the dust of neglect but of stillness, as if the very air had been grieving for years. Sunlight struggled through grimy window panes, illuminating columns of dancing particles in the gloom. The air was stale, smelling of cold ashes and forgotten things. There was an order to the house, but it was the sterile, rigid order of a museum, where everything was in its place but nothing was ever touched. It was a house that had been scrubbed of a woman's presence, a home hollowed out by loss. Maeve saw it all with an observant quiet. She did not ask questions. She simply tied an apron around her waist and began. Her first act was to open the windows. She pushed against the swollen frames, her strength surprising, and let the clean, sage-scented air rush in, chasing out the ghosts of stale sorrow. She swept, and the sound of the broom against the wooden floors was a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in the silent house. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees, polished the dark wood until it held a deep, mournful gleam, and washed the windows until the fierce prairie light flooded every corner, leaving no shadow unexposed. She moved through the cold rooms with a purpose that was its own form of prayer. In the kitchen, she found the heart of the home, cold and dormant. She cleaned the soot from the great iron stove, laid a fire, and soon the smell of baking bread, rich with yeast and warmth, began to push back against the chill. It was an aroma of life, of sustenance, of beginnings. Caleb would return from the range, his face a mask of exhaustion and solitude, and the scent would meet him at the door. He would see the clean floors, the glint of light on a polished table, the mended curtain by the window. He never spoke a word of acknowledgement. He would eat the warm stew she left for him, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls, and then retreat into the shadows of his study. But he saw. In the vast, echoing silence of his house, her quiet, steady work was a language he was slowly, reluctantly, beginning to understand. She was not just cleaning his house, she was patiently, methodically, trying to coax it back to life. The ghost that haunted the Thorn Ranch most keenly had a name, Lily. She was a small, silent child of 6, with her father's stormy eyes and a fragility that seemed ill-suited to the harsh landscape. She moved through the large house like a whisper, a pale imitation of a child, her laughter a forgotten sound. She had been 2 when her mother passed, and grief had been her only governess since. When Maeve arrived, Lily watched her from the shadows of doorways, a wary creature assessing a new and unknown presence in her territory. Maeve, in her wisdom, did not press. She did not coo or offer false smiles. She simply included the child in the circle of her warmth. She spoke to her as if she expected an answer, but did not seem troubled when none came. She would narrate her tasks in a low, gentle voice. "Now, we need the dough, push and fold, to make it strong," she would murmur, her capable hands working the flour. One afternoon, as the scent of cinnamon filled the kitchen, Maeve began to hum an old lullaby, a soft, meandering tune from a life lived long ago and far away. Lily, drawn by the melody, crept closer than she ever had before, her small fingers clutching the doorframe. Maeve broke off a piece of the sweet, warm dough and held it out without looking directly at the child. "For you," she said softly. Hesitantly, a small hand reached out and took the offering. It was the first bridge. Lily began to follow Maeve, a constant, silent companion. She would sit on a stool in the kitchen, her feet not touching the floor, and watch Maeve's hands as she stitched a seam or peeled potatoes. The silence between them was not empty, but companionable. The turning point came on a quiet evening. Lily had found a small, silver-framed photograph in a dusty box. She carried it to Maeve, who was darning one of Caleb's socks by the firelight. She held it up, her expression solemn. It was a woman with a bright, beautiful smile and eyes that laughed. Caleb's late wife. Lily touched the glass with a reverent finger. Then she looked from the smiling woman in the photograph to the kind, gentle face of the woman before her. In a voice made rusty from disuse, she asked a question that shattered the carefully constructed peace of the house. "Was she beautiful?" Lily whispered, her gaze direct and unwavering, "like you?" The simple, profound innocence of it struck Maeve with the force of a physical blow, a validation she had never known, and in the other room, Caleb, who had heard the child's clear voice, felt a painful, unfamiliar thawing deep within his frozen heart. The small changes, at first, were almost imperceptible, like the slow greening of the prairie in spring. Caleb began to notice things. He noticed the way the fire was always lit when he came in from the cold, its warmth a silent welcome. He noticed his favorite tin mug, once dented and dark, was now clean and bright on its hook. He noticed that Lily's hair was no longer a tangled mess but was neatly braided each morning, a dark, shining plait down her back. One evening, he heard a sound so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. It was the sound of his daughter laughing, a real, bubbling laugh, as Maeve showed her how to make a cat's cradle with a piece of string. He stood unseen in the doorway, a sentinel at the edge of their light, and a feeling he couldn't name, a sharp, aching pang of something that was not quite grief and not quite joy, lodged itself in his chest. His world had been a silent, monochrome landscape for 4 years, and this woman, this unsuitable woman, was slowly, patiently painting it with color. She never demanded anything of him. Her presence was a quiet offering. She mended a tear in his heavy canvas coat, the stitches so fine and even they were nearly invisible, a small act of care that felt more intimate than a touch. He found himself lingering in the kitchen after his meals, nursing a cup of coffee, the silence between them no longer a chasm but a shared space. He watched her hands, strong and gentle, as she moved about her work. He saw the grace in her movements, the solid, comforting substance of her, and found a beauty there he had never been taught to recognize. The world saw her as too much, he was beginning to see her as exactly enough. One day, returning from a long ride checking fence lines, he saw a single, defiant purple wildflower growing by the stable door. On impulse, he dismounted and picked it. He carried it into the house, its stem awkward in his calloused hand. He felt a fool. What was he doing with a flower? He entered the kitchen. Maeve was at the sink, her back to him. He could not bring himself to give it to her, to speak the words that would explain the gesture. The old habits of silence were too strong. So he simply laid the small, vibrant flower on the scrubbed wooden table and left the room without a word. When he returned for supper, the flower was gone from the table. It was tucked into a small glass of water on the windowsill, a spot of vivid color against the vast, empty prairie, a silent acknowledgement of his silent acknowledgement. The sky had been a deceptive, brilliant blue all morning, but by midday, it began to change. A bruised, purple-gray stain spread from the western horizon, bleeding across the vast emptiness. The wind, once a gentle whisper through the tall grasses, picked up a keening, mournful edge, scraping at the corners of the house like a restless spirit. Caleb came in from the stables, his face grim, the wind whipping his hair across his brow. He tasted snow on the air. "Blizzard's coming," he announced to the quiet kitchen, the words clipped and devoid of emotion, but Maeve heard the urgency beneath them. A bad one, he did not need to elaborate. On the plains, a blizzard was not an inconvenience, it was a siege. It was a white monster that could swallow the world, burying fences, livestock, and men alike. The work began immediately, a frantic but efficient race against the darkening sky. Caleb moved with a contained energy, securing the livestock in the barn, checking the latches on every door and shutter. Maeve worked alongside him in the house, her movements just as purposeful. She brought in extra firewood, stacking it high beside the hearth. She filled every spare bucket and basin with water from the pump, knowing it would soon freeze solid. She checked their stores of flour, salted meat, and dried beans, her mind a quiet ledger of their chances for survival. They worked in a practiced, unspoken rhythm, two people braced against a common enemy. Lily, sensing the rising tension, grew quiet and watchful, her small face pressed against the windowpane, watching the first fat, heavy snowflakes begin to drift from the sky. As dusk fell prematurely, the world outside the windows dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The wind howled, a physical presence that shook the very foundations of the house. Inside, the three of them were trapped, a tiny island of warmth and light in a churning sea of ice and fury. The house, which had once felt so vast and empty, now seemed small and fragile against the storm's assault. And in the oppressive, roaring silence, another, more terrifying sound emerged. It was a small, dry cough from Lily, a sound that seemed impossibly loud, a tiny crack in their defenses that threatened to bring everything crashing down. The storm was no longer just outside, it was coming for them from within. The blizzard raged for 2 days, a relentless assault of wind and snow that erased the world. The house groaned under the weight of the drifts piling against its walls, and the windows were opaque with frost, sealing them in a dim, twilight world. Time lost its meaning, measured only by the dwindling pile of firewood and the rising ferocity of Lily's fever. Her small cough had deepened, settling in her chest with a rattling sound that terrified Caleb. Her skin was hot to the touch, her cheeks flushed a painful, feverish red, and she began to murmur in a delirium, her wide eyes seeing things that were not there. Caleb, a man who could command 1,000 acres and 100 head of cattle, was utterly, devastatingly helpless. He paced the floor of the small bedroom, his large frame seeming to shrink with every ragged breath his daughter took. All his wealth, all his strength, was useless against this invisible enemy. The fear he had buried for 4 years clawed its way to the surface, raw and suffocating. It was the same fever, the same rattling cough, that had stolen his wife from him, and he felt a cold, paralyzing dread that history was about to repeat itself. It was Maeve who became the anchor in the storm. She moved with a preternatural calm, her face set in lines of grim determination. Her past, filled with its own hardships and trials, had forged in her a deep reservoir of practical strength. She took charge, her voice low and steady. "We need to break the fever," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She sent Caleb to fetch snow, which he melted and mixed with vinegar to bathe Lily's burning forehead. She brewed teas from the dried herbs she found in the pantry, filling the sick room with the sharp, medicinal scent of yarrow and mint. She sat by Lily's bedside for hours on end, a solid, unwavering presence, whispering soothing words, humming her low, gentle lullabies. She never faltered, never showed fear. She was a pillar of quiet competence in the heart of the chaos, and Caleb found himself leaning on her strength, his own crumbling around him. He watched her, this woman he had hired, this woman the world had deemed unsuitable, and saw a warrior. She was fighting for his daughter's life with a tenacity that humbled him, and in the dim, flickering lamplight of the sick room, surrounded by the howling fury of the blizzard, he began to understand that she was fighting for him, too. Night fell, an impenetrable darkness beyond the frosted windows, indistinguishable from the swirling white of the day. The only light in the house came from a single lantern in Lily's room, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The wind shrieked, a relentless, primal scream. Lily was fitful, her small body trembling beneath the heavy quilts. Maeve sat bathing her forehead with a damp cloth, her movement slow and rhythmic. Caleb stood by the window, staring out at a whiteness he could not see, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. The silence in the room stretched, taut and heavy, filled only by the storm and the child's labored breathing. It was a fever like this. Caleb's voice was a raw, broken thing, a sound wrenched from the depths of his soul. He did not turn from the window. It took Mary. Just after Lily was born. The doctor said it was childbed fever. She was so strong, so full of life. And then, she just burned away the confession, held captive for full long years, spilled into the small room, stark and painful. He finally turned, and in the flickering lantern light, Maeve saw the anguish that had carved the hard lines on his face. His eyes were not stormy now, they were shattered. "I couldn't stop it then," he whispered, his voice cracking. "And I can't stop it now." He sank into a chair across the room, burying his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The fortress he had built around his heart had finally crumbled. Maeve did not move from her spot beside the bed. She continued her gentle ministrations, her presence a quiet anchor. After a long moment, she spoke, her own voice soft, colored with a sadness that matched his. "My father used to say I took up too much space in the world," she began, her eyes fixed on Lily's sleeping face. "He said no man would have me, that my size was a curse from God. My mother would try to starve me thin, convinced it was for my own good. When they sent me out here, it was not with hope. It was to be rid of a burden." She paused, the memory a palpable weight. "The man who was to be my husband, he looked at me as if I were spoiled livestock. Unsuitable. I have spent my whole life feeling like I was worthless because of the shape of my body." In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the threat of death, they laid their broken pieces before each other. He, the man who had lost everything, and she, the woman who had never been wanted. In that shared darkness, their wounds touched. He looked up, his tears subsiding, and saw her, truly saw her for the first time. He saw not her size, but her immense strength. He saw not a hired housekeeper, but a woman of profound grace and courage. They were two profoundly lonely souls, stripped bare by fear and grief, finding a fragile, unexpected solace in the crucible of the storm. As if tied to the small life flickering within the house, the storm's fury began to wane with the coming of the third dawn. The wind's howl softened to a low moan, and the relentless snowfall ceased. A strange, luminous quiet descended upon the world, a world remade in white. And inside, in the small, warm bedroom, Lily's fever broke. The fire that had consumed her receded, leaving her skin cool and damp with sweat. She opened her eyes, clear and lucid for the first time in days, and whispered a single word, "Mama." She was looking at Maeve. A profound, bone-deep relief washed over Caleb, so potent it left him weak. He watched Maeve soothe his daughter, brushing the damp hair from her forehead, her touch infinitely gentle. The house was no longer a cold, sterile monument to grief. It was a sanctuary, a place of healing. The silence that settled in the aftermath of the storm was different. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of before, but a soft, comfortable quiet, filled with the unspoken understanding of all they had endured together. In the weeks that followed, a subtle transformation took place. Caleb found reasons to be in the house more, mending a piece of tack by the fire instead of in the cold barn. He started to talk, not much, but enough. He would tell Maeve about a new calf that had been born, or point out a hawk circling in the sky. Lily, now fully recovered, was a different child, her laughter echoing through the rooms, her hand almost always tucked into Maeve's. One morning, the need for supplies became unavoidable. They loaded the wagon and made the long journey into town, the landscape pristine and dazzling under the bright sun. The air in the general store was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and gossip. As Maeve was examining a bolt of calico cloth, a man stepped in front of her, blocking her way. He was well-dressed but had a weak chin and small, cruel eyes. It was Mr. Finch, the man who had written the word unsuitable. He sneered, his gaze sliding over Maeve with open contempt before landing on Caleb. "Thorne," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "I see you've taken in my discarded mail. Didn't think anyone would be desperate enough to take on damaged goods." The casual brutality of the word sucked the air from the room. Every eye turned to them. Maeve froze, the old, familiar shame washing over her, hot and sickening. She felt her size, her unworthiness, her utter isolation. This was the moment the fragile peace they had built would be tested, out here in the harsh light of the world's judgment. The general store fell into a dead silence, broken only by the ticking of the large clock on the wall. Every customer, every loafer by the pot-bellied stove, was watching, waiting. Finch stood with a smug, self-satisfied smirk on his face, enjoying the public humiliation he was inflicting. Maeve felt herself shrinking, wanting the floorboards to open up and swallow her whole. She could feel Caleb's stillness beside her, a coiled, dangerous energy. She expected him to be angry, to be embarrassed, to perhaps turn and walk away, leaving her to bear the shame alone as everyone else always had. But he did not move. Instead, he did something that shifted the world on its axis. He turned slowly, deliberately, and placed his hand on the small of her back. It was a simple gesture, but it was a declaration. It was a claiming. It anchored her, steadied her, and told the entire room that she was with him. He did not look at Finch with anger. His face was calm, his winter storm eyes cold and clear. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the sharp edge of tempered steel. "This woman," he said, his gaze never leaving Finch, "is my wife." The two words hung in the air, solid and irrefutable. My wife. He let the statement settle, letting its weight crush Finch's petty cruelty. "You will show her the respect she is due," he continued, his tone dropping even lower, carrying a quiet threat that was more menacing than any shout. "Or you and I will have a conversation outside." Finch's smirk vanished, replaced by a flush of red that crept up his neck. He stammered, unable to meet Caleb's unblinking stare, and quickly scurried out of the store like the rodent he was. The tension broke. People began to busy themselves again, but their glances were different now, filled with a newfound respect. Caleb did not remove his hand from her back. He guided her to the counter, past the display case of cheap jewelry. His eyes scanned the contents and stopped on a simple, unadorned silver band. "We'll take that one," he said to the storekeeper. Without ceremony, he took her left hand, his thumb gently tracing a line over her knuckles, and slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The ride home was silent, but it was a silence that rang with the echo of his words, with the solid, cool weight of the ring on her finger. It was the silence of a promise made, a vow declared not before a preacher, but before the world. Spring arrived at the Thorne Ranch not as a gentle guest, but as a vibrant, forceful reclaiming of the land. The snow melted, feeding the creeks until they ran full and clear, and the vast, monochrome prairie exploded into a riot of green, dotted with the brilliant yellows, purples, and blues of wildflowers. The air, once sharp with cold, was now soft and fragrant with the smell of damp earth and new life. The ranch, once a reflection of Caleb's frozen heart, now mirrored the hope that had taken root there. The house itself had been transformed. Its windows were open to the warm breezes, and the sound of Lily's laughter was as common as the birdsong outside. Maeve had planted a garden in the patch of earth behind the kitchen, her hands turning the dark soil, coaxing tender green shoots from the ground. It was a plot of land that had lain fallow for years, and now it was teeming with the promise of squash, beans, and tomatoes. She found a peace in the rhythm of the work, in the connection to the living, growing earth. One late afternoon, as the sun began to cast long, golden shadows, Caleb came to her in the garden. He didn't speak, just knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands resting near hers on the soil. He watched her for a long time as she gently firmed the earth around a young tomato plant. The silver band on her finger caught the fading light. He had learned her language first, the language of quiet action, of steady presence. Now, he was slowly learning his own. He reached out and placed his hand over hers, his touch warm and sure. Her fingers stilled beneath his. "This place was just a house," he said, his voice a low rumble, soft with a feeling she was just beginning to trust. "It was a shell. I didn't know how to live in it anymore." As he looked around, at the greening fields, at the sturdy barn, at the child playing near the porch, her hair a bright flag in the sunlight. He looked back at Maeve, his gaze holding hers. "You came here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you made it a home." It was everything. It was the apology for his coldness, the thanks for her care, the confession of a love that had grown as quietly and persistently as the seedlings in her garden. She turned her hand in his, lacing her fingers through his. They were two people the world had deemed broken, a man hollowed by grief and a woman burdened by shame. But here, on this vast and resilient land, they had found in each other the missing pieces of their souls, forging a new family not from a perfect design, but from the sturdy, beautiful reality of their shared, imperfect hearts. Their peace was earned, their love as boundless and as promising as the prairie sky stretching out above them.